sharing his desire to talk with God, and he is going to kind of build an argument here through the first 5 verses, and then present his argument in verse 6. And then he's going to do a similar thing in verses 7 through 12, where he's going to use some illustrations from nature about how man is a far different creation than some of the other things that are going on. But let's start with verse 1, Job chapter 14, and we'll read down through verse 6. Man that is born of a woman is of few days and full of trouble. He cometh forth like a flower and is cut down. He fleeth also as a shadow and continueth not. And dost thou open thine eyes upon such an one, and bringest me into judgment with thee? Who can bring a clean thing out of an unclean? Not one. Seeing his days are determined, the number of his months are with thee, thou hast appointed his bounds that he cannot pass. Turn from him that he may rest, till he shall accomplish as an hireling his day. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Now, Father, tonight as we continue to study the book of Job, we see always, in all aspects, whether he's answering his friends or whether he's talking to you, that he holds you in very high regard. But we also see a very deep hurt and struggle of someone who has been through the worst of it. And he is looking unto the author and finisher of his faith. And Father, when things get tough for us, it's imperative that we keep our eyes not fixed on the problem and not fixed on possible solutions that we think could come from other sources around us, but to keep our eyes fixed on you. For you are a friend that sticketh closer than a brother. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Now, Job has been working his way through here, and the last verse of chapter 13 kind of dovetails here with chapter 14, because he's going to build this argument using some illustrations, and he already used some at the end of the chapter. But what he starts here is a statement of human frailty. Man that is born of a woman is of few days and full of trouble. Now, the statement that we see here in verse 1 is important, because what he's doing here, this is a very poetic and a very nice way of saying everyone, all y'all. His buddies don't always say that and don't always mean that when they talk to him. But what he's doing here is he's refuting the friend's argument that the righteous are blessed and the wicked are judged. Because he's making this premise statement, if you will, this foundation that he's going to build up to the conclusion he wants to bring before God here in verse 6. And this foundation is that all people are born the same way and all lives are too short. Sometimes we say, somebody died when they were young. Oh no, they were only 20 years old. How awful that they died so young. But what Job is saying here is, if you think about it, big picture, fish-eye, looking at the whole spectrum, it's kind of a tragedy because everybody really dies young. And so he's making this comparison, the contrasting argument here that he's going to lay out in the second half of the verse is, and it's full of trouble. And so you have these two statements, it's few of days, and then you have full of trouble. Few of days, when you look at it as a whole, you live to be 100 years old nowadays, and people go, wow, man, they lived a really long time. That's a long life. Psalm 90 in verse 10 discusses man's life. And when you look at the perspective of Psalm 90 in verse 10, 100 is a long time. It says, the days of our years are 60 years and 10. A score is 20. So if you had 60 years, that's 60, and 10 is 70. And if by reason of strength they be 80 years, yet is their strength labor and sorrow, for it is soon cut off and we fly away. So he's saying, listen, 70 years is a good long time. Now, we know people are living a little bit longer now, so 70 doesn't seem so unreasonable. But think about the people in the Bible, especially in New Testament times, that lived to be 70 years old. Now, that's why it's so remarkable when you have a priest who is still ministering in the temple and he's 80 years old, and God promised him, you're not going to die until you get to see the salvation of Israel. 80 years old was long time. So in perspective here, you're looking at this. Genesis chapter 47 and verse 9. When we think of long age, we tend to think, well, people, back in the early time lived to be really long. And they did. But that's not even at the end of Genesis. The folks who were living 700, 800 years old are at the very beginning of the book. The people at the end of the book of Genesis aren't living that long. In Genesis 47:9, Jacob said unto Pharaoh, the days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130. Few and evil have the days of the years of my life been, and have not attained unto the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage. So even Jacob here, you think about that. That is 130 years is considerably longer than 100 years, which is considerably longer than 70 years, and if by reason of strength, 80 years. So we see passages that mention that shortness, and we're not going to go back to the flood and talk about how God started shortening the lifespan, but Jacob's looking back and saying, I'm only 130 years old. And when he looks at the whole of his life, he says, it's short and it was evil. Now think about that. How would you like to get to the end of your life and all you could think about your whole days was that it was really short, even though it was 130 years old, and he's probably outlived quite a lot of folks around him, and it's evil. But when you think back to the whole situation with Joseph and the reason that Jacob is being moved down to Egypt, he thought he was losing a son, and you got the boys fighting, and then you have famine, and they're having to go down and get food and come back, and all of the uncertainty of it. And sometimes it's easier to look at the whole block of it and say, I've had a whole lot more of these tough times than I had of the really good times. And that's the perspective that Jacob brings. That's kind of a little bit of what Job is saying here. When you look at my life, it is short and it's full of trouble. Now, the way he puts this together, it's all poetry, so it's interesting in and of itself. But he says, full of trouble. Full, the word means to be completely satisfied. In other words, no room for dessert. Could you imagine you're sitting there at a Thanksgiving meal and you have eaten and eaten and eaten and eaten, and then all of a sudden they come out and they put the desserts on the table and you are so stuffed you couldn't eat 2 bites of whatever your favorite dessert is. You'd have to be pretty full. And that's the picture. But what he says here is full of trouble. And this is an interesting word because it means to tremble or to quake. So it's not just things that were alarming. When God shows up to Nebuchadnezzar, his knees shake. When God shows up to Belshazzar, his knees shake. There are times where he confronts people and it says the bands of his joints were loosed. That's another really poetic way of saying what Job is saying here. I am full of trembling and quaking. The word is used of an earthquake in 1 Samuel 14:15 and 2 Samuel 22:8, literally the shaking of the ground. It's used of inner turmoil in 2 Samuel chapter 18 verse 33 and Isaiah 32:10. So somebody who's so worked up in their spirit that there is a visible shaking on the outside. And then in Isaiah 37:29 and 2 Kings 19:28, it is used to describe someone who is full of rage. And it doesn't say angry or upset. It literally says rage. In other words, they are so upset they're shaking. There is a visible reaction on the outside to what is happening to them on the inside. That's the picture that Job is using here with this contrasting argument. My life is few of days. Well, if they're few of days, you'd really want to enjoy them. You'd really learn to appreciate the sunshine. Sometimes somebody gets a terminal diagnosis and you say, well, you probably only have 2 or 3 months to live. Well, what do you want to do with your last remaining days? How are you going to make them count? And that's the thought here. My days are few, so how can I make them count? But I can't really make them count because they're so full of trouble that there isn't room for dessert. He goes on into verse 2 and he uses an illustration of the brevity of life. He cometh forth like a flower and is cut down. He fleeth also as a shadow and continueth not. Now, this is why I say chapter 13 dovetails into chapter 14. Because if you go back to chapter 13 and you read the last verse, he gives 2 examples of this, a rotten thing and a moth-eaten garment. So if you take like dirt that is decomposing or something that you threw out on the compost pile and you're watching it rot away, and then you take a moth-eaten garment, one is more guts to it than the other. A garment is flimsy, a rotten thing has some stuff to it. Then you jump over to chapter 14 and you look at verse 2 and you see this continuation kind of the thought, because you have a flower which is a whole lot more flimsy than a garment, but a little bit of stability, and then you have a shadow, and what is there to a shadow? I mean, there isn't even any substance at all. And so he starts the thought in chapter 13, and he's building this argument towards God that, listen, I am a pretty weak individual. A flower grows quickly. We were out working on a trouble call today, and I was walking down this lane, and there were a whole bunch of crocuses that had bloomed out. A couple of days ago, we were by a house, and I saw them poked out of the ground about that much, and these were full up and wide open. Just took a little bit more heat and a little bit more encouragement, and all of a sudden, bam, there they were. And they were beautiful. They're beautiful in bloom. But how long do crocuses last? No time at all. They're such an encouragement to us because they're one of the first flowers that pops out in spring, but it's not even the middle of summer, usually, and the crocuses are all gone. And so while they were beautiful and they were such an encouragement to you that spring is coming and better times are ahead, all of a sudden it has withered quickly. And there could be a lot of reasons for that. The end of the growing season, or unseasonable drought, or a late frost, or somebody fired up their lawnmower and went through the lawn, and next thing you know, cut their heads right off, gone. And you got just some remnant of a stalk there, but nothing beautiful or encouraging, if you will, about it anymore. And go to Psalm 90, verses 5 and 6. In Psalm 90, if I can get it to behave here, thou carriest them away as with a flood. They are as a sleep. In the morning they are like grass which groweth up. And you say, well, what's the big deal? There's a lot of promise of something in the morning. The promise of a new day, the dew that is refreshing, the early morning sunlight that begins to warm everything. In the morning, in verse 6, it flourisheth and groweth up. In the evening it is cut down and withereth. So in one day, it could be gone. I used to always think it was crazy. I asked my grandmother, when are the morning glories going to bloom? And she'd say, in the morning. I was like, seriously? Yeah, when you get up, run down there by the milk house, and they'll be open and they'll be out, and they are. But then when the sun comes out, what happens to the morning glory flower? And it does it as a self-preservation thing. It's preserving water, but it's a very quick thing. So if you sleep in until 1 o'clock in the afternoon, you're not going to see much of a morning glory. And that's the point that he's making here. The flower, while it is beautiful in its time, it is very short, and there are a lot of things that can cut short the beautifulness of it. The second thing that he says here in verse 2 is the shadow. Now, when I think of a shadow, I think there's no real substance of its own. It can't really do anything in and of itself. It's actually just a creation of the sun, right? So if you don't have a sun, if you have a really overcast day, you don't have a shadow because you don't have the light that's necessary to create it. Therefore, a shadow follows the motion of a sun. You walk in over here and you see a shadow, and then you come over here, and now it'll be on your other side. It's not going to stay on this side because you've turned your body in relation to the sun. The contrast of it changes. When it's early morning, your shadow is going to be longer, and the closer you get to noon, the shorter and less defined your shadow is going to be. And it gets smaller and smaller and smaller until all of a sudden there you are at high noon, and guess what? You don't have one. Unless you look straight down, you see just the tiniest little thing between your feet. But there's not a whole lot of shadow there. Psalm 102, verse 11. By the way, it is pretty interesting how often the Bible talks about our life as a withering flower or withering grass and as a shadow. It's not the only illustrations that it uses, but it is two of the most prevalent and powerful ones. Psalm 102, verse 11. My days are like a shadow that declineth, and I am withered like grass. You get both of them. Jump over to 144 in verse 4. Man is like to vanity. What's vanity? Emptiness. You say, wow, emptiness? What kind of emptiness? And he gives us an example. His days are as a shadow that passes away. Now, when a shadow is gone, how much imprint did it leave behind? How much effect did it leave behind? None. You can't get up in the morning and walk out there and say, oh yeah, my wife was standing out there at the driveway because I can see where her shadow used to be right there in the flower bed. No, when the shadow's gone, there's nothing left behind. And so that's why he calls it vanity. There's emptiness because when the days are like a shadow that pass away, what does man really leave behind? Who won the Super Bowl 12 years ago? You'd have to sit there and think, and I know there are some poor sports people going, let's see, that would have been between so-and-so and so-and-so, and maybe they can even remember the game-winning play. But most of the time, you have a hard time remembering something that happened a little bit ago, and the farther and farther you get away from it, the less and less you remember most of the time about it. Well, now just go one generation or two generations later, and there's no substance there that people can remember. Let's go back to our passage in Job and look at verses 3 through 6, because he's building an argument here for relief. And that's why he's using these illustrations. God, you know that I am like a flower or like a shadow. So now he's going to ask two rhetorical questions. And the first one is, and dost thou open thine eyes upon such a one? In other words, are you sharply observing me? And the rhetorical answer is yes, God is. And so what he's saying here is it feels like I'm being scrutinized with this dogged, suspicious, incessant vigilance. It seems like no matter where I turn, you have me under the microscope, if you will, like analyzing every little aspect of what I'm doing. And then the second question, also rhetorical, and bringest me into judgment with thee. Are you examining me so carefully and so continuously and so minutely that you can judge me more? And again, rhetorical, yes. He's trying to find a cause to punish me, is what it feels like. It wasn't enough to do this judgment. It wasn't enough to do this judgment. It wasn't enough to do this judgment. Here we are, however long it's been elapsed, and I've lost all of my stuff, and I've lost my kids, and I've lost my health, and my friends seem to have turned against me. It just seems like I'm under the microscope, and you keep looking for something to beat me over the head with. The conclusion that he offers here: can it be right that a man so frail and laden with sorrow should be treated so harshly? You see what he's doing here in the first two verses? He's saying, you know that anybody that's born of a woman, and that's everyone. We're not going to get into politics here, but it's everyone. Name somebody that wasn't born of a woman. I mean, they could be adopted by somebody that's not a woman, but they're not born of a woman. And so, cut and dried, are full of trouble. And Job's saying, life is hard enough anyway. Why the microscope and why the exacting judgment that is going on in my life? So what he's trying to say here is, it seems below you, God, to use your power to crush me. Because when you consider how short my life is and how difficult it is anyway, it almost seems like a waste of time. Remember, he's building to a conclusion here. Verse 4, understanding of total depravity of man. What a great verse. Who can bring a clean thing out of an unclean? Not one. This is a cardinal theological doctrine necessary to the gospel. Every man is sinful. He is not claiming to be perfect or sinless. Now, if you remember, Zophar accused Job of that in chapter 11 and verse 4. Do you consider yourself sinless before God? Job wasn't saying, I'm sinless. He was saying, I can't think of any unconfessed sin. Huge difference between the two. Job recognizes that he's a sinner. He just can't think of a sin that would be worthy of the punishment that he's being put through here. And so now he's laying it out there and he says, is it possible to bring something clean out of something unclean? Foundational understanding of man is that all have sinned and that all are born with a sin nature. Romans 3:23 and Romans 5:12. We know that sin entered the world by one man, and by one man it's been dealt with. Ephesians 2:3, same thing. In other words, and this goes against the Catholic Church, but no one can cleanse himself from sin, and no one can cleanse anyone else from sin, because how can something pure come from something sinful? And so he's not, his argument here, and his friends are listening, but he's not talking to his friends. I can't declare myself clean from sin, because how can purity come from impurity? So what he's doing is he's asking God to weigh in on the situation, because God is the one that has to declare him clean. God is the one that has to declare him righteous. God's the one who has to weigh in and say, he is right before me, or he's not right before me. Cannot have sinless from sinful, because we are all descendants from Adam and Eve. Turn with me, if you will, to Psalm 51 and verse 5. Trying to stay fairly close by here. But this is another good one that says the same thing. Psalmist had a very good understanding of this. Behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Now, what happens first, the conception or the birth? It's obvious, right? I mean, it's just plain and simple. And so you do away with the whole argument that disciples have with Jesus in the middle of the book of John when they are addressing the blind man and they say, well, who sinned, this guy or his mom, that he was born blind? All they had to do was go back here to Psalm 51:5 and realize that everybody is created with a sinful nature at conception, and so it wasn't a matter of trying to sin in the womb, and it wasn't something that mom did after she was already pregnant, because everybody is born with a sin nature. Which brings up an excellent part of the gospel, because Jesus had no sin nature because he had no earthly parents biologically. Matthew chapter 1, verses 18 through 23. Angel comes to Joseph and says, don't be afraid to take Mary, because the Holy Spirit has come upon her, and this thing that is happening to her is an act of God. So a virgin shall be with child and give birth. Now, can you trace the bloodlines of dad's side of the family and mom's side of the family? Absolutely. But Jesus is born without a sin nature because he didn't get it from his mother or his earthly father. Which means that Christ is the perfect Redeemer because he's sinless. And he's the perfect judge because he's sinless. You can't have clean come from unclean. Now again, Job is not claiming to be sinless. What he is asking for here is an explanation of why his sin deserves such punishment. God, you know that I am a sinful person because you created me, and you know that I have a sin nature, and you know that clean can't come from unclean. But why is it that it seems like this really oppressive judgment on me if there isn't any difference in my sin nature and anybody else's sin nature? Look at verse 5 of Job 14. Understanding of God's sovereignty. Again, he's almost done building his argument, and he's getting ready to plead his case before God, if you will, in verse 6. Verse 5, seeing his days are determined, the number of his months are with thee, thou hast appointed his bounds that he cannot pass. This is a masterful statement about the sovereignty of God. Job understands the sovereignty of God. And just to make sure that everybody listening gets it, he uses this trichotic. Going to give 3 examples, and I'm going to tell you 3 different ways that I know that this is true. God is the giver of life, and as the giver of life, he's the only one that controls life. So he is the one who controls length of life also. If you give it, you can control it, and you can take it away. The 3 terms that he uses here to describe length is days, months, and bounds. Days is the Hebrew word yom, which always in the Bible means a literal 24-hour day. And so he starts off and he says, seeing his 24-hour days are determined. And then he says, and the number of his months. That is the word for a new moon. And that's how calendars used to go. New moon to new moon was a month. And so each new moon, when God created the celestial beings, it says in Genesis that he set them up for times and for seasons. Indicative of the fact that we were going to measure it and we could tell how long we were living because of those times and seasons. And then the third word is a really interesting word, the bounds. It means an appointment, a decree, a limit. In other words, Job is saying, you are the limitation of my last breath and my last heartbeat. So he uses a day, a literal day, and then he uses a longer term, and you'd think, well, now he's getting ready to talk about years, but he doesn't talk about years. He just jumps ahead to the last moment on earth, basically, is what the bound is that we see here. And Hebrews 9:27 tells us, And it is appointed unto man once to die, and after that the judgment. It's the same type of meaning here. It doesn't matter what you try to do to change it. You're not the giver of life, so you're not the controller of life, and you can't change that appointment, or you can't change that boundary. Then the control is described, and he's going to use a control word for each of the words. Seeing his days are determined. That word means to decide or to decree. And then he says, and his months is with you. Now what's so interesting about this, there's no verb action here. They add some stuff here in the English so that we can understand, but literally, what he's saying here, the number of months with you. In other words, you have total control. Everything is exactly known with you. Everything about my life completely rests with you. That's the statement that he's making about the months. And then it says, appointed for the bounds, and that means something that is accomplished. In other words, this has been set, and even though it hasn't happened yet, it's kind of interesting because the Greek has a word for that too that we've looked at a couple of times. You can count on it as if it's already happened because God said it's going to happen. That's the accomplished here. And so even though you're talking about something in the future, you're talking about it as if it's a done deal because God's the one that can control it and nobody can mess with it. So this statement that he makes here in verse 5, he says, everything about my life is in your power and at your disposal. So here's his plea for mercy in verse 6. This is what he's been building to in these first 5 verses. Turn from him that he may rest till he shall accomplish as an hireling his day. Now, if we're going to say this in easy English, we'd say, please give me a break. That's what he's saying. I just wish you'd give me a break. We saw this after chapter 3 when he said, I can't even swallow down my spittle. It's the same thing. It just keeps coming so fast and so furious and so relentless that it doesn't seem like I even have time to swallow and get ready for the next thing. Would you consider treating me differently? That's what the word turn from him means. Would you consider a change of the way that you are addressing me and dealing with me? One last time to Psalms chapter 39 and verse 3. That isn't right. Wonder if it's 29. That's all right. Psalmist is crying out the same thing. It has been interesting as I have been digging through the book of Job, how many times that there are references back to the book of Psalms, and sometimes a lot of them. Like if you cross-reference some of the words that Job is using here, and then you go to the Psalms, you find out that even David, in some of the midst of his persecution and being chased all over the place, he uses some of the illustrations that Job uses, and he uses some of the language that Job uses in the same way. It's almost like, man, how long do I have to deal with this before you're going to step in and take care of my adversaries? Or how long before? And think of David's situation when he's writing those Psalms, because he's already been anointed, right? Samuel came down, poured oil on his head, and you think, hooray for David, he's going to be king. And then a long period of time goes by while he is in the worst circumstances of his whole life. He's running and hiding in caves. He doesn't have an identity. He's all over the place. And yes, God's taking care of him. But man, it's not the kind of stuff you want to write home to mom about. It's not a vacation. And he knows that there are better times ahead. But then you take what David's saying in the Psalms, and you look at what Job is saying here in his book, and you say, but wait a second, because Job hasn't had an anointing, and nobody told him that, pretty soon he's going to get to be king. And so when he's looking down through the tunnel, he's hoping that there's light at the end of the tunnel, and he doesn't see anything. David feels the same way Job does, but at least there was light at the end of the tunnel because he knew God had promised him something. Now, he is in dire need of some comfort and some ease. That's what he is telling God. I wish that you would treat me a little bit differently, because I am in dire, desperate need of it. And if you go back and look at this verse, he's going to use another example here that we can feel. Turn from him that he may rest. You say, what's the big deal? Well, he gives us the idea with the illustration that he uses. Till he shall accomplish as an hireling his day. Now, a man's life is like a hired hand, is what Job is saying. He works hard. He eats his meal out in the field with sweat dripping off of his brow. He has to deal with whatever comes up during the day to accomplish the task that he has been told to do. So planting corn or picking it or taking care of the cows or whatever he's supposed to be doing. But whatever the situation comes up with, if the temperatures are 100 degrees, it's a whole lot harder to accomplish your day's work than if the temperatures are 80 degrees. And that's the picture that he's painting for us. And what he's saying here is a hired hand, or a hireling as the word is, that's out in the field trying to accomplish what he's supposed to that day, doesn't need greater trouble to overcome while he's trying to get through the day. And a master will usually let his worker take a break from time to time while trying to get through the day. When the temperatures get ridiculous, a game is said, you're going to have this, and you're going to have this, and you're going to have this. In soccer, we play 40-minute halves. No timeouts, no break. Well, when it gets really, really hot, sometimes the officials will blow the whistle at halfway into it, 20 minutes, and they're like, all right, water break. You got 2 minutes. No coaching, just everybody get some fluids, take a breath. Because they're worried that it's getting dangerous out there. Everybody's sweating so hard, and they don't hardly get a chance to catch their breath. And that's the picture that Job's trying to do. I am trying to be a hireling, dealing with the difficulties of this life, because it's just a few days and it's full of trouble. And while I'm trying to get through this life and do my best, it seems like all of this stuff has been piled up on me, and I don't ever get a break. But even a master would look at his servant and say, man, it's 100 degrees out there. We need to give this guy a chance to take a 15-minute break and relax, get under a shade tree, get a drink, do whatever. What he's saying here in verse 6 is, I am doing my best work, but it doesn't seem like I can catch a breather at all. And it's really, really starting to wear on me. I feel like it's late in the day, and I'm wondering if I'm even going to make it to quitting time. You can see that Job is feeling overwhelmed. And again, he has made some great doctrinal statements in this section, but he's not saying anything that is wrong. He is not saying anything negative about God. He's just asking for clarification, because it doesn't seem like my life is worthy of the judgment that I'm having to bear up under.